Hello again. This is Andy Pogue. I'm a minister at the Spencer Hill Church of Christ. Doing this video tonight. I'm going to post it for Wednesday night. If you are looking for a Bible study, I want us to think about a couple of Old Testament characters and how that might fit into our present situation. When you talk about 9/11, there's a chord, a response that comes out in all of us. We remember that so well, that tragic time when we think about shootings, school shootings, and things like Columbine and Fort Hood and all of those. Likewise, they strike a chord in us. And I guess at some point, the spring of 2020 may do that at some point. And when those things happen, when the tragedies happen in our life, whether we're young or old or rich or poor, this has been one of those things that just happens to all of us, and we all feel that. And so we know that bad things happen to good people, and accidents, for example, happen daily. And whether it's an accident, whether it is a tragedy like a shooting or the tornadoes that took place weeks ago, or the present COVID-19 pandemic, we're left with the question of why. Why is there suffering in the world? And we want some reason for it, some predictability, some preparation. It's like the randomness of what happens is the most terrifying the most terrifying thing that we experience. And after people go through tragedies like the tornadoes or accidents or those sorts of things, we're left asking ourselves questions. We may feel guilty and angry or empty. And we think, well, if I had just not gone here, or if we had done that, if we'd stopped sooner, if I had gotten my family out of the house or to a safe place quicker, if I hadn't gone this route, and all of those sorts of things. And so we ask why. We want order in our lives because God is a God of order. He certainly is, right? Genesis 8:22 says this: while the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, winter and summer, and day and night shall not cease. God is a God of order. He does things in order, and he told Noah that after the flood. 1 Corinthians 14:33 says God is not a God of confusion, but of peace. God is a God of order, and so we try to order our lives. We surround ourselves with date books and calendars and clocks and all of those things, but that doesn't always work. That's not always sufficient. Why does a family in Tennessee, everything goes fine, they go to bed, and a tornado strikes? Why is it that someone is living their life and everything seems to be going well, and yet they're struck with an illness, whether it is COVID-19 or cancer, or a man has a heart attack, or all of those things that might happen, and so we're left to ask ourselves why, and why is it so difficult to go through those things? Well, I think often it is because we want to put some sort of a pattern. We want to make some sort of sense out of our lives, and we want some kind of control. And as we get a little older, maybe we recognize that that's really the difficult part, is not being in control. And when we ask ourselves, what if I had done this differently? What if we had not gone here or done that? When we think about that, we have to realize that there's a certain amount of power that goes along with that question. We went that way because that was the best way to go. We chose to do this on that day because that's just how we chose to do it. Do we really want the power to know the future? Because that's the only way to prevent those things from happening, right? Do we really want to do that? Well, that option is not available for us, is it? I mean, we can't know the future. We can't know what the consequences of every action that we take is. And so the best thing we can do is to make sure that our strength is in our faith, that our faith is strong enough to sustain us through the storms of life. Trees bend to the wind, and it's that movement that makes them strong. And if a tree never experiences a storm, it doesn't have much of a root, and there's no strength to the wood. And so some people weather those storms better than others, right? And I believe that it's a learned trait. I don't think it's just how we are. And so we have to learn to live with the hope of a future. How do we go about doing that? Well, I want us to look at two characters from the Old Testament for our Bible study night. I'm not going to go verse by verse. These are both several chapters long, but I challenge you to read the books of Genesis and the book of Job, and for your personal study. And when you do, I think maybe you will begin to gain some insight into questions like we might have tonight. First of all, we have Job. Job is a man, this is a very old book, it's probably one of the first books of the Bible written. Job lived in a time that he was a very rich man, and he had a great possessions and great influence in his society. He had a wonderful family, and the Bible tells us that he was very concerned about them, and he was very devoted to God. He was a very good man. We also see that Satan recognizes this, as God does, and comes before him and begins to ask God certain questions. And God asks Satan, have you seen my servant Job? Satan's response, of course, is that Job doesn't serve you for nothing. Job is your servant. Job's a good man because you've blessed him so much. And you take away this and that, and you'll see how he does. And of course, you know how the story goes. God allows Satan to take away certain things from Job, his health, his family, his possessions. And we see then there are several chapters where Job and ultimately his friends are questioning what's happened. Why is this happening? What is this? And the friends are not much help. They say, well, Job, you must have done something bad. You must have done something wrong. God wouldn't pick on you like this if you had not. So why don't you just confess whatever sin it is and whatever evil it is that you've done, and let's get that out of the way. Job's wife is no better. She encourages him to curse God and to die, to get that over with. He's a man who's lost everything. He's a man who is in great physical pain and distress. And so, but in the end, we see that Job's perspective changes. And let me just challenge you to read through. It's not that long a book, and as you go through, you'll see Job's perspective begin to change, and he looks at this in a different way. And ultimately, he comes down to being close to God at the end, and that's where he comes to. And God challenges Job with a series of questions there toward the end of the book, and it's Job's response to that, I think, that begins to let him see exactly what is going on in his life. Let me read you from Job chapter 40, beginning verse 3. That Job answered the Lord and said, behold, I am vile. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand over my mouth. Once I have spoken, but I will not answer, yes, twice. But I'll proceed no further. And then you go down to chapter 42, the first verse beginning. Job answered the Lord and said, I know that you can do everything, and that no purpose of yours is withheld from you. You ask, who is it that hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore, I have uttered what I did not understand. Let's focus in on that. Job 42, verse 3. I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me that I did not know. Job says, you know what? I spoke out of hand. I wasn't right. I shouldn't have said that. And through it all, Job learns a couple of important truths. First of all, he learns that the randomness of life, and even in the randomness of life, that there is an almighty, there is a creator, and there is a God who's in control. And Job couldn't always see that. Job could not see the picture as God saw it. And the second thing he learned was that in suffering, he did have power. He did have some control. His power and his control is how he's going to respond to the circumstances that have come his way. And Job's response is going to impact others. And also that his response mattered to God. And so does our response matter to God. We really have no control over the events of our lives, but we do have control over how we respond to it, right? And that response matters to us, and it matters to people through the years. Maybe that'll impact our family or someone else in a way. I mean, we're still reading about Job thousands of years later. We're reading about Joseph thousands of years later. It wasn't just their families that were impacted. It goes beyond that. And certainly that's true of us today. The second story I want us to look at, and I challenge you to look in the book of Genesis, and there you're going to see toward the latter part of that book a story of a great man named Joseph. Starts out as a young boy. He's a favorite son. He's hated by his brothers. Ultimately, they grab hold of him and they throw him in a pit to decide what to do. They want to kill him, but he's sold into slavery, carried away into a foreign land, far away from his father who loves him. And he's sold to a man named Potiphar, who allows Joseph to have control of his house. But Potiphar has a wife who has desires for Joseph. He should not be with her, and he avoids her, but ultimately he is falsely accused by her of attacking her, and he's thrown into prison by Potiphar. And it's not enough that he's been taken away from his home and he's been treated so unfairly. He's done nothing wrong in all of these circumstances. But now he's in prison with a glimmer of hope. He interprets a dream for a butler and a baker, and he thinks that one day, maybe, when the butler is back in the good graces of Pharaoh, that he'll be able to tell Pharaoh about this innocent man that he met in jail. But again, Joseph winds up on the short end of the stick. The man forgets about him, and we think, how could that happen? But he was probably afraid to speak to Pharaoh about this, and so he lingers in prison until, of course, Pharaoh needs him to interpret a dream, and then he remembers, the butler remembers, and Joseph is brought in, interprets the dream, rises to prominence there in Egypt, but now his brothers come back. The brothers that have sold him so many years ago into slavery, now they're back. And they're there to buy grain because of a famine that's taken place in their homeland that God has predicted and God has used Joseph to prepare for. And they're there, they don't recognize Joseph. They come before him, and a wonderful series of events that he finally reveals himself to them. He wants to make sure that they are sorry for what they've done and that they've changed, and they have. And so there's this reunion between the father and Joseph, between Benjamin, his brother, and of course the brothers who have done evil to him. But there's a lingering little bit of tension there, and that is that the brothers think, well, now when daddy's gone, Joseph will get even with us then. And then he'll make up for all this time and all these years and all that we did to him. But at the end of the story of Joseph, we see that after his father dies, he calls his brothers in and he says, you know what? I'm not going to get even with you. You're going to live in peace, and I'm going to take care of you, and your children are going to be fine. And so we see the end of the story is not really the end. Like Joseph, there's a story in a story. And even though he couldn't possibly see God's providence at work in the way that it was, he could see that God is able to use the tragedy in his life to accomplish wonderful things. Notice what he says in Genesis 50 and verse 20. But as for you, he's speaking to his brothers, as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good in order to bring about as it is this day, to save many people alive. The Job and the Joseph stories remind us that our lives fit into a holy plan beyond what our minds can comprehend. We'll never know how God is using us or the events that go on in our lives, even the tragedies that happen. We'll never understand that. Job and Joseph had no idea that their story would be told generation, thousands of years later. We'd still be talking about these two men and how their integrity, how their steadfastness in doing what was right comes through, and what an example they are. Your life is like a landscape that extends beyond what you can possibly see. And who knows what experiences you have, good or horrible, how they may influence people for years to come. God can triumph over evil if you'll let him work in your life. And so I want us to end our Bible study with two thoughts, two truths. The first one is that suffering is part of the freedom of choice. We suffer because there is evil in the world, because there's sin in the world. Sometimes it's our own sin. Sometimes it's the sin of others. And that brought about the fall of man. That brought about the disease and the death and the suffering that came into the world. God made the world perfect. And it was sin that corrupted it. And it was the sin that man brought into the world that did that. But one of the things that God gives us is a choice, how we're going to respond to whatever may happen. And because some people respond in a way that is bad, and sometimes people do evil things, do we really want to take away that right, the choice? God could have made us beings that could not sin. He could have given us no choice at all when it came to that. And yet, that's not what we want. Listen, we understand that in our relationships. We want people to love us because they love us, because they think that we're lovable, not because they're forced to. And a love that is forced is not a love at all. That's what God wants from us. And so we understand that. We understand that suffering is part of living in a world with choices. The other thing that we learn and that we see and we experience in life, and that is that suffering is just part of life. It's going to come along. And God never promised us a perfect life, an easy life. He never promised that there would be no suffering. He never promised that life would be fair from our perspective. And so sometimes we ask, why me? The question is, why not me? Why should I avoid this any more than anyone else? What makes me so special that I'll be delivered from all pain and suffering and loss? Well, let me ask you this question. What would happen if God only allowed suffering for people who did not serve him? That's the question that Satan posed to God, wasn't it? That's the scenario. God, Job is only serving you because you've blessed him so much. What if God truly, physically, materially, every way blessed those who served him, and those who did not, he punished with suffering and loss and those things? Well, let me ask you, why then would you serve God? You'd serve God because you don't want to suffer, right? You don't want to do that. It would be like God compelling us to serve him and to love him. Why do we love him? Why does he want us to love him? Well, because of all the wonderful things that he's done for us. And so we begin to understand a little bit. Maybe as we mature, maybe as we live life a little bit, maybe as we just get a little older and we see this over and over again, that God is good and he is loving and he is merciful. But that doesn't mean that God's people are never going to suffer. That doesn't mean that bad things are never going to happen to us. And we love God not because he blesses us, but we love God in spite of the suffering. Because very often we serve God when we don't get what we want. Let me quote, I don't know who said this. I wish I could find it, but it said, a world of fairness will give people what they desire. A world of fairness. In our idea of fairness, we would all get what we want. That's how we define fairness, if I get what I want. But a world of grace gives us more than we deserve. Isn't that a great thought? A world of fairness gives us what we desire, but a world of grace gives us more than we deserve. Sometimes there are no good answers. Sometimes there are not answers that satisfy us. Why do good people suffer? Why is life so random and so unpredictable? Well, let me end with this thought. It comes from Isaiah 55 and beginning at verse 8. Isaiah 55:8. God is speaking there through Isaiah and to Isaiah, and he says this, my thoughts are not your thoughts, nor are your ways my ways, said the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts higher than your thoughts. God is God. We can't see the timeline that God has. We can't see the future that God is already in and knows very well. What we do is love him each day, try to grow closer to him, try to be more what he would have us to be, and try to deepen our faith so that we can weather the storms of life. Like Job, sometimes we've got to close our mouth and acknowledge that God knows what he's doing, even when we can't see the outcome. I hope that you will study the book of Job and the book of Genesis to learn about Job and Joseph. And I hope they'll bring you comfort, maybe even in this time of suffering that we go through. And maybe you can be a blessing to others around you. Thank you for listening.